The Silent Storm, a story of hidden greatness. The martial arts instructor challenged a maintenance worker to a match for entertainment. But what unfolded next left the entire training facility speechless. "Hey there, cleaner. How about giving us a quick display?" called out Derek Mitchell from the mat center, his dark belt shining beneath the gymnasium's bright overhead lights. "I'm betting you've never witnessed genuine combat in your entire life, correct?" James Washington paused his floor cleaning and gradually raised his head. At 42 years old, he'd been employed as custodial staff at this facility for merely 3 weeks, consistently arriving during evening hours after all practitioners had departed. However, this particular Thursday evening, the advanced sessions training had extended beyond its normal schedule. "I don't wish to disturb your practice, instructor," James responded peacefully, continuing to work on removing a persistent mark from the flooring. "Just completing my duties so you can resume your activities." Derek released a boisterous, dramatic chuckle that reverberated throughout the gymnasium. Everyone observed this. This fellow is too frightened to even approach the training area. The 8 practitioners present laughed uncomfortably, several clearly uneasy with the developing situation. What Derek remained unaware was that James had dedicated the previous 20 years attempting to entirely erase who he truly was. 2 decades since departing the competitive arena following an incident that permanently altered his existence. 20 years concealing a truth that not even his teenage daughter was aware of. "Come along, friend," Derek persisted, moving closer with that condescending grin he employed to intimidate newcomers. "Just a brief display. I'm confident you don't even understand how to maintain a proper defensive position. How about demonstrating to my pupils the distinction between someone who practices and someone who merely maintains the premises?" James experienced that recognizable feeling in his chest, like a sleeping muscle awakening after years of dormancy. His gaze briefly met Derek's, and momentarily, something passed between them that caused the instructor to involuntarily retreat a step. "Simply an instructional demonstration," Derek maintained, now attempting to conceal the sudden doubt in his tone. "Nothing overly intense. Just to illustrate to beginners why respecting the martial discipline is crucial." James placed the cleaning bucket down and rose gradually. His movements possessed a smoothness that seemed unusual for someone who had supposedly never stepped onto a training mat previously. Throughout the gymnasium, students ceased their practice, sensing that something significant was occurring. "Very well," James stated finally, his voice composed at a lake's surface before a tempest. "However, when we conclude, you'll offer an apology to everyone here for transforming the training area into a spectacle." Derek chuckled, though this time the sound carried forced undertones. "Apologize? Friend, you'll be the one expressing regret to the floor when you encounter it." What none of these individuals understood was that James Washington had previously been known as James Silent Storm Washington, 5-time global mixed martial arts champion. He had stepped away at his career's peak following an accident that claimed his closest friend and training companion's life. From that moment, he had pledged never to engage in combat again. Yet certain vows are destined to be broken when personal dignity becomes threatened. If you're appreciating this tale of triumph over adversity and justice, remember to subscribe to follow how a simple instance of bias will become the most embarrassing education of Derek Mitchell's lifetime. Derek adjusted his dark belt with theatrical flair, clearly relishing every moment of attention. "Everyone, form a circle. You're about to witness a practical illustration of why hierarchy exists within the martial arts realm." James observed as the 8 students created a semicircle surrounding the mat. Some appeared eager for the demonstration, others visibly uncomfortable. A young Asian woman with pulled back hair whispered something to her neighboring classmate, who simply shook his head disapprovingly. "Observe, everyone," Derek continued, gesturing dramatically. "Here we have an ideal example of someone who never grasped that certain locations are suitable for specific categories of individuals. Premium gymnasiums aren't intended for, well, you understand." James felt that familiar ache in his chest, the identical sensation he'd experienced 20 years prior when hearing comparable remarks about fighters who didn't resemble typical champions. The distinction was that presently, at 42, he had discovered how to transform anger into fuel for something far more potent than physical strikes. "Instructor Derek," the young Asian woman interrupted hesitantly, Perhaps we could continue our regular training? It's becoming late and... Sarah Chin, are you questioning my instructional approach? Derek interrupted her harshly. Take a seat and observe. You'll acquire more knowledge in the following 5 minutes than during a month of standard training. James noticed how Derek used the girl's complete name, a clear display of authority. He also recognized the fearful expression in her eyes, the same look he'd seen in his mirror 2 decades ago when he awakened in panic. Recalling the accident that took Tony Hammer Rodriguez's life, his closest friend and training partner. Tony had perished because of him. It was that straightforward. A series of strikes that James had delivered with excessive force during practice. Tony collapsed, struck his head on the ground strangely, and never regained consciousness. The investigation determined it was accidental, but James understood the reality. He had lost control due to pressure and racist remarks from spectators that evening. So, custodian, Derek sneered, how about showing my students proper defensive positioning? Or is that too complex for someone who only understands cleaning equipment? Laughter echoed around the gymnasium, but James remained motionless. His eyes closed momentarily, and briefly he was transported back to that Las Vegas ring, hearing identical comments that preceded the tragedy that forever changed his existence. What's wrong? Are you frightened? Derek insisted, now circling James like a hunter. Or will you simply stand there like a fixture, as you do with cleaning tools throughout the day? That was when Derek committed his first critical error. He lightly pushed James's shoulder, a seemingly innocent contact, but one carrying all the arrogance of someone who had never faced genuine consequences for his behavior. James absorbed the push without shifting an inch. His feet remained anchored to the ground like tree roots, and Derek felt as though he had attempted to move a concrete barrier. The instructor's arrogant smile wavered momentarily. Fascinating, James murmured, more to himself than Derek. It's been some time since someone attempted to provoke me in that manner. There was something in James's voice that altered the atmosphere. It wasn't threat or anger, but the terrifying calm of someone who had traversed much darker paths and emerged transformed. Derek, unable to interpret the warning signs, intensified his approach. Did you hear that, everyone? He finds it fascinating. How about we demonstrate the distinction between thinking and understanding? What Derek failed to realize was that every humiliating word and action was awakening something in James that had remained dormant for 2 decades. Not anger or vengeful desire, but something far more dangerous. The crystal-clear memory of who he truly was when he stopped concealing himself. Sarah Chin observed the scene with increasing discomfort. There was something about how the custodian breathed, how his muscles tensed almost imperceptibly, that reminded her of nature documentaries about large predators. The stillness before the strike. Final opportunity, buddy, Derek announced, now clearly irritated by James's lack of response. Either you accept the demonstration like a man, or I contact security to remove you. And guess what? You'll lose your employment as well. James opened his eyes slowly. When his gaze met Derek's, the instructor felt a chill course down his spine, as if he had just awakened a dragon he'd mistaken for a harmless lizard. Acceptable, James said finally, his voice low but filled with an authority that instantly silenced everyone present. However, when we finish, I want you to explain to your students why you transformed a place of learning into a circus of humiliation. Derek laughed, but this time the sound was nervous. Explain? Friend, you'll have considerable explaining to do when you're on the ground. What neither understood was that James had spent the previous 20 years not only fleeing his past, but perfecting emotional control that had transformed his former destructive rage into something far more refined and devastatingly effective. Each new humiliation only strengthened a quiet power within him, a cold determination that his former opponents knew well, but Derek was about to discover in the worst possible manner. Derek adjusted his stance, clearly pleased with the respectful silence that had descended over the gymnasium. His 8 students formed a perfect circle around the mat, some eager for the demonstration, others visibly uncomfortable with the situation developing before them. Everyone, you are about to witness instruction worth more than 6 months of training, Derek announced theatrically, extending his arms like a performer. The distinction between those who dedicate their lives to martial arts and those who simply, Clean the floors where genuine fighters walk. James stood motionless at the mat center, but something had changed in his breathing. His eyes closed briefly, and momentarily, he was no longer in that Denver gymnasium. He was back at the National Gymnasium in Las Vegas 22 years ago, hearing identical comments from the audience before his world championship bout against Victor, the Demolition Man, Petrov. Look at that little black fellow. Someone in the stands had shouted that distant evening. I bet he won't survive 3 rounds against a real fighter. James had won by technical knockout in the second round, but victory had cost him dearly. The pressure from racist comments had caused him to lose control during the subsequent sparring session, resulting in Tony Rodriguez's accidental death. So, custodian, Derek sneered, now circling James like a predator, how about showing my students how not to maintain a basic guard? Or is that too complicated for someone who only understands cleaning equipment? That's when Sarah Chun could no longer remain silent. The 22-year-old purple belt in jiu-jitsu and graduate student in sports psychology had spent the previous 2 years documenting discrimination cases in athletics for her thesis. What she was witnessing was valuable academic material, but also deeply disturbing. Instructor Derek, she interrupted firmly, may I ask you a question? Why exactly do you believe it's necessary to humiliate someone who is simply performing his job? The silence that followed was deafening. Derek slowly turned to Sarah, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of surprise and irritation. Excuse me, Sarah, but who's conducting this class? You are, she replied calmly, but that shouldn't include racial humiliation disguised as technical demonstration. Several students exchanged nervous glances. No one had ever confronted Derek like this before. The instructor felt his face flush with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. Racial? Derek laughed forcefully. This has nothing to do with race. It concerns respect for martial arts and understanding your place. James opened his eyes slowly. There was something in how Sarah had spoken, in the courage of a young woman standing up to establish authority, that reminded him of his younger sister, Keisha. She had possessed that same determination, that same refusal to accept injustice silently. Keisha had died at 17, victim of a stray bullet during a police confrontation in her neighborhood. James was competing in Japan when he received the news. Another beloved person lost while he pursued glory in distant rings. Another reason to abandon everything and disappear into simplicity of an anonymous life. Sarah, Derek said in a dangerously low voice, if you cannot respect my teaching methods, perhaps you should seek another gymnasium. There are places more suitable for people with your mentality. The threat hung in the air like toxic smoke. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but she maintained her ground. My tuition is paid, instructor, and I believe everyone here deserves a learning environment based on mutual respect, not humiliation. That's when James did something no one expected. He began to smile. It wasn't a nervous or submissive smile. It was a slow, calculated smile of someone who had just found a reason to stop hiding. For 20 years, he had carried the weight of guilt for 2 deaths that had indirectly resulted from his involvement in the fighting world. Now, seeing a brave young woman defending principles of justice that he had abandoned decades ago, James Washington began to remember who he really was. Derek. James said finally, his voice carrying quiet authority that made everyone in the room turn to him. The young lady is correct. This isn't about martial arts. It's about you attempting to feel important by diminishing others. Derek spun on his heels, his face red with indignation. How dare you lecture me about martial arts? You don't even understand what a dojo is. James took a step forward, and something fundamental changed in his posture. His shoulders straightened, his center of gravity lowered imperceptibly, and his feet positioned themselves in a stance that any experienced fighter would instantly recognize as perfect. Actually, James said calmly, I understand exactly what a dojo is, and I know this place ceased being one long ago. Derek felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. There was something about how James moved now, how he occupied the space, that awakened all his self-preservation instincts, but his wounded pride wouldn't allow him to retreat. Enough talking, Derek growled, assuming his favorite fighting stance. I'll teach you respect a difficult way. Sarah watched the scene with growing apprehension, but also with professional fascination. She had documented hundreds of hours of sparring and competitions for her research, and something about how the custodian moved reminded her of the great masters she had studied in historical videos. The economy of movement, the controlled breathing, the presence that radiated contained power. James closed his eyes briefly and allowed 22 years of muscle memory to resurface. Every technique perfected, every victory earned, every lesson learned in the most brutal rings worldwide. When he opened them again, Derek was looking directly into the eyes of Silent Storm Washington, 5-time world mixed martial arts champion. Final chance to apologize, James offered gently, to her, to your students, and to transform this place back into a learning space. Derek laughed, but the sound emerged nervous and forced. Apologize? Friend, you'll be pleading for forgiveness when you're on the ground. What Derek couldn't see was that James had already identified all his technical weaknesses. The high guard that left his body exposed, the tendency to retreat with his right leg first, the way he telegraphed his punches with micro-movements of his shoulder. 22 years away from the ring had erased decades of refined technical analysis. Sarah noticed that other students were instinctively backing away, like wild animals sensing an approaching storm. Something in the room's energy had completely changed, as if the air had become electrically charged before a lightning strike. It was when everyone laughed at Derek's latest taunts that something unexpected began to take shape in James's expression. Not anger or desire for revenge, but the calm determination of someone who had found a cause worth breaking a 20-year vow of silence for. Some of those present began to realize that something extraordinary was about to occur, even without fully understanding what their eyes were witnessing. Derek assumed his favorite fighting stance, the one he had used to intimidate hundreds of beginners over the years. Feet shoulder-width apart, fists clenched at chest level, weight slightly forward. The classic stand of someone who had learned martial arts in controlled environments against predictable opponents. James stood motionless for several seconds, simply observing. His eyes scanned Derek from head to toe, automatically cataloging every technical detail. The high guard that left his ribs exposed, the unstable base that compromised his balance, the excessive tension in his shoulders that telegraphed every move before it even began. Still waiting? Derek sneered, hopping slightly on his feet. Or are you just going to stand there like a fixture? That's when James did something no one expected. He started to move. It wasn't a dramatic change, just a subtle repositioning of his feet, a slight lowering of his center of gravity, his shoulders relaxing into a perfectly horizontal line. But to anyone who knew what to look for, the transformation was instantaneous and frightening. Sarah Chin felt a chill run down her spine. During 2 years studying sports biomechanics, she had analyzed hundreds of hours of footage of great fighters. What she had just witnessed was a transition from an ordinary man to a born predator, a change as subtle as it was devastating. Interesting, Derek muttered, his confidence wavering for the first time. There was something about how James occupied the space now that awakened all his self-preservation instincts. James took a step forward, and Derek instinctively backed away. The movement was so involuntary, so primitive, that several students noticed. A black belt retreating from custodian? The power dynamic in the room had completely shifted. Problem? James asked softly, his voice carrying quiet authority that silenced everyone. Derek felt blood rush to his cheeks. His reputation was being questioned in front of his own students. He couldn't retreat now, even though every fiber of his being was screaming at him to stop and apologize. No problem, Derek replied, forcing a smile. Just admiring your posture. Did someone teach you that on YouTube? The joke fell flat. No one laughed. The tension in the room had become almost palpable. Actually, James said calmly, I learned at a place called the Las Vegas National Gymnasium. Perhaps you've heard of it. Derek frowned. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place the reference. Las Vegas? What kind of weekend boot camp did you attend there? Sarah Chin discreetly pulled her phone from her pocket and quickly typed, Las Vegas National Gymnasium Martial Arts. What she found made her blood run cold. This wasn't just any training facility. It was where the world's greatest MMA champions of the last 3 decades had trained. Derek, James continued, his voice still calm, final chance. Apologize to Sarah for questioning her right to speak. Apologize to your students for turning this place into a circus. And most importantly, apologize to yourself for becoming exactly the kind of person that martial arts should teach you not to be. The offer of clemency hung in the air like smoke. Derek could have chosen humility. He could have acknowledged that he had crossed a line. He could have preserved what little dignity he had left. Instead, he attacked. Derek's first punch was technically perfect. A fast, accurate jab executed exactly as he had learned in the manuals. It was the kind of punch that worked against 99% of the people he had sparred with over the years. James wasn't in that 99%. The movement was so fast, so fluid, that half of those present couldn't even process what had happened. James simply wasn't where Derek's fist had been aimed. His body had slid to the side like water flowing around a rock, and suddenly Derek was off balance. His arm extended into thin air. "Nice attempt," James commented softly, already repositioned and perfectly balanced. "Clean technique, adequate speed, but you telegraphed a move with your right shoulder." Derek spun wildly, trying to locate his opponent. How had someone moved so fast? "Beginner's luck," he muttered, more to himself than to James. The second attack came in quick succession. Jab, straight, hook. 3 punches linked together with the precision of someone who had practiced the combination thousands of times. It was his favorite sequence, the one he used to finish sparring sessions and impress beginners. Again, James simply wasn't there. This time, Sarah managed to follow the movement. James had lowered himself slightly, allowing the jab to pass over his head by inches. The straight punch found only air when he leaned back in an impossible curve. And when Derek threw the hook with all his strength, James took a small step back, causing the fist to pass millimeters from his chin. "Interesting combination," James observed, still breathing evenly. "Works well against people who stand still, but you're leaving your left side completely exposed after the hook." Derek was starting to sweat. This wasn't normal. He had landed thousands of punches in his life, and now he couldn't land a single one on a man who had supposedly never fought before. "Stop dancing and fight," Derek shouted, launching an even more aggressive sequence. That's when James decided the demonstration had gone on long enough. Derek's third attack, a desperate combination of punches and kicks, found only air once again. But this time, something different happened. When Derek recovered after missing all his blows, James was inexplicably closer. "How?" Derek whispered, realizing he had completely lost control of the distance. "Derek," James said softly, now an arm's length away, "do you want to know the difference between someone who learned to fight in gymnasiums and someone who learned in professional rings?" Before Derek could answer, James did something that defied everything those present thought they knew about physics. Without appearing to use any force, without any sudden or aggressive movements, he simply touched Derek on the chest with the palm of his right hand. Derek flew. He wasn't pushed or knocked down. He was literally propelled backwards, as if struck by an invisible wave. His feet left the ground. He traveled nearly 2 meters through the air and landed on his back with an impact that made everyone in the room gasp. The silence that followed was absolute. Derek lay on the floor for several seconds, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened. There was no pain, just the irresistible force of someone operating on a level completely different from anything he had ever known. "That," Derek muttered, trying to get up, "that's impossible." Sarah Chin had stopped breathing. In 2 years of studying martial arts, she had never witnessed such a controlled and devastating display of power. There was no brutality, no anger, just a clinical application of a technique she had only seen in legends. "Actually," James said calmly, extending his hand to help Derek to his feet, "it's quite simple once you understand leverage, timing, and energy transfer. Principles I've learned over a 22-year professional career." Derek ignored the outstretched hand and stood up on his own, his legs still shaking. 22 years? Professional career in what? Sarah answered, her voice almost a whisper. "You don't understand who he is, do you?" Everyone turned to her, who was still holding her cell phone with the search results. On the screen, dozens of articles, photos, and videos confirmed what her instincts had already realized. "James Washington," she read aloud, also known as Silent Storm, five-time world mixed martial arts champion, considered one of the best technical fighters in history, retired undefeated after a 22-year career, following an accident that resulted in the death of his training partner. The impact of the words hit the room like a bomb. Derek felt his face go pale as reality set in. He had challenged a living martial arts legend. He had publicly humiliated someone who could have knocked him out with a casual move. Five-time world champion? Derek stammered, all his arrogance evaporating instantly. James nodded silently. I retired at 29. Since then, I've been working whatever jobs I can find. Cleaning, maintenance, simple jobs, simple life, no spotlight, no cameras, no need to prove anything to anyone. The transformation in Derek was instantaneous and painful to watch. The arrogant man was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the magnitude of his ignorance. I didn't know, Derek whispered. If you had known, would you have treated me with respect? James interrupted gently. But would you still have humiliated some other custodian? Another worker who had no credentials to defend himself? The question cut deeper than any physical blow. Derek realized that James had put his finger on the root of his real problem. Not ignorance about credentials, but a fundamental arrogance that made him believe he could humiliate people based on their professions. Sarah stepped forward, her voice firm. Instructor Derek, for 2 years I have trained at this academy out of respect for your experience. But what I witnessed today was not teaching. It was bullying disguised as instruction. Other students began to murmur in agreement. The revelation about James had completely changed everyone's perspective on what they had witnessed. James, Derek said finally, his voice laden with a humility no one had ever heard before, I sincerely apologize. To you, to Sarah, to everyone here. I have no excuse for my behavior. James nodded, accepting the apology with the same grace with which he had mastered the physical confrontation. Appreciated, Derek, but apologies are only the first step. The question is, what are you going to do differently from now on? Derek looked around the room, seeing his students with new eyes. Some seemed disappointed in his behavior. Others were clearly reevaluating everything they thought they knew about respect and hierarchy. I'll change, Derek promised. It'll take time, but I'll change. That's when Sarah asked a question that surprised everyone. Mr. Washington, would you consider teaching again? Because I think we could all learn a lot more from someone who understands that true strength comes with responsibility. James smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him that night. Perhaps, but not to teach fighting techniques. To teach something much more important. That respect isn't earned with belts or titles, but with character. As Derek fully absorbed the most humiliating lesson of his life, one question hung in the air. Would one night of humility be enough to transform decades of arrogance, or would an even deeper change be necessary for true justice to be served? 3 months later, the gymnasium had been completely transformed. James Washington was no longer just a custodian. Sarah Chin had convinced the gym owner to hire him as an instructor specializing in advanced techniques and martial arts philosophy. Derek Mitchell lost half of his students in the first week after the incident. The video Sarah had discreetly recorded spread across social media, showing a black belt being humiliated by a mere custodian. His reputation in the martial arts community was ruined. Instructor James, Sarah said after a class on respect and humility, thank you for teaching me that true strength doesn't need to be displayed to be recognized. James smiled, organizing the equipment. The best lesson I can teach is simple. Never judge someone by their profession or appearance. Everyone carries stories that can surprise us. Derek continued teaching at a smaller gymnasium, but now with humility forced by public shame. He had learned the hard way that arrogance comes at a price. Sometimes justice comes quietly, like a storm that transforms everything without making a sound. James proved that true revenge is not destroying your opponent, but showing that greatness comes from character, not titles. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.